Hello and welcome to Unit 17 of Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. This material on the endocrine system can be found in Chapter 6. Okay, so in this lecture I'm going to be discussing first of all how hormones work. And basically hormones are intercellular signals that are sent from one cell to another, telling the other cell, the target cell, which genes to turn on or turn off, and that is the way that we affect the behavior of different types of cells. Hormones are intercellular signals where cells send signals to each other, except instead of sending signals by radio waves or television waves or satellite dishes, they use various types of hormones. Now there are several different types of hormones that differ mainly based on what they're made of. There are the steroid hormones, which are derived from cholesterol, and we learned about cholesterol and what cholesterol does. The main use for cholesterol in the body is that cholesterol is it's inserted into the plasma membrane to make the plasma membrane more rigid and stronger. But if you take cholesterol and if you modify it a little bit and you add a little bit here and there and add a few ornaments to cholesterol, you will create a number of different steroid hormones, which the body uses to send intracellular signals around to different parts of the body. As you would have guessed, a peptide hormone is a hormone that's made of a small protein. There are a few hormones like that. Generally, just as a matter of interest, steroid hormones will survive going through the stomach. So if you need hormone treatment, you can usually give somebody hormone treatment by giving them a pill that contains that hormone, because a lipid like cholesterol or modified cholesterol can pass through the stomach unaltered. But if you're dealing with a peptide hormone, if you take it as a pill, the stomach will break it down into individual amino acids the way it would do for any protein. So obviously peptide hormones cannot be taken orally. They cannot be taken through the stomach. The most obvious example of that is insulin. Insulin is a peptide hormone that's produced by the pancreas, and it cannot be taken as a pill. You have to inject it. They are doing some experimentation with some of these peptide hormones, like insulin, for instance, where you might be able to inhale it, and then the peptide hormone may cross the membrane in your lungs inside the alveoli, and so you don't have to be injecting it all the time. But I don't know what the current status of that kind of research is. But that is one of the kind of things that they're looking at. And finally, there are a number of hormones that are made simply by taking an amino acid and adding a few ornaments to the amino acid. So those are referred to as modified amino acid hormones. All right, now, what types of signals do the hormones send to adjacent cells? What types of hormone signaling do we have? Okay, well, endocrine signaling usually refers to sending hormones out into the blood. So you have one group of cells that are producing a hormone. Generally, if you group together a whole bunch of cells, they form an organ. So most of the endocrine organs are glands. So a gland is defined as an organ that has a duct or a little tube, a duct, D-U-T-C. And the duct is a little tube that secretes the hormone out into the environment. There are different types of glands. Endocrine glands are glands that secrete the hormone that they're producing into the blood, whereas exocrine glands secrete the hormone, or exocrine glands produce things usually that are not hormones and send them out in tubes, in long tubes. But we'll talk about the difference between endocrine glands and exocrine glands later. But anyway, endocrine usually refers to a hormone signaling where you have a gland that secretes a hormone into the blood, and the hormone travels a long distance until it reaches its target organs. Paracrine signaling refers to one cell sending a signal to another over a short distance. Usually, if you have two different cells that are located in a soft tissue or something, they will simply send a hormone that crosses the interstitial space between cells, which is quite small. And finally, autocrine This is what happens when a hormone actually stimulates itself. So the hormone, a cell will stimulate itself by secreting a hormone for which the cell itself has a receptor. Okay, so hormones are sent out, and the cell that receives the hormone has to have an appropriate receptor to receive that hormone. So, we discussed earlier on the fact that erythropoietin is produced in the kidneys, and it travels through the blood to the bone marrow. So that would be an example of endocrine signaling. And there are hematopoietic stem cells in the bone marrow that have receptors for erythropoietin. Meanwhile, there are other cells in the body. Most of the other cells in the body do not have a receptor on their surface for erythropoietin, and therefore it doesn't matter if erythropoietin is sent out into the blood. It won't affect any other cells. It will only affect the cells that have an appropriate receptor to receive that signal. So autocrine signaling is a slightly unusual type of hormone signaling, where a cell will produce a hormone that cell itself has a receptor for, and therefore the receptor is stimulating the cell is stimulating itself to do things, which is kind of rare. All right, now we talked about endocrine glands as things that secrete hormones, glands that secrete hormones, and we're going to discuss in detail all the different endocrine glands, including the pituitary gland, which is located in the brain. We already heard about the pituitary gland when we discussed the renal system. The pituitary gland, for instance, produces a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. And that hormone's job is to increase the amount of water that is retained in the kidneys. Okay, so that's an example of a hormone that is produced and secreted by the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is actually quite an impressive endocrine organ because it secretes dozens of different hormones under instructions from the brain. And in fact, the pituitary gland secretes so many hormones that it's easier for us to talk about it in terms of if we divide the pituitary gland into a posterior segment and an anterior segment. So there are a dozen hormones that are produced by the back side of the pituitary gland, and there are a dozen more secreted by the front side of the pituitary gland. And this is quite extraordinary, considering that it's only about the size of a pea. It's a pea-sized organ, but it's responsible for the secretion of dozens of different hormones, and it's responsible for controlling dozens of different bodily functions by sending out these intracellular signals. The pineal gland is also located in the brain, and the pineal gland is responsible for making us sleepy. It produces a hormone called melatonin, and so that hormone makes us sleepy when it's dark. The pineal gland is inhibited from producing producing melatonin by light, which means that when it's light, that is why it's harder for you to get to sleep, because the hormone that's produced by the pineal gland, the melatonin, is only produced in the dark. So if the light is on, it's difficult for you to sleep. We'll talk about the thyroid hormone and the parathyroid hormone, which are located just above the larynx. You remember when we talked about the respiratory system, we talked about the cartilage that the anterior part of the larynx is made of. We talked about that as being made of thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage is named because it's sitting right below the thyroid gland. The adrenal glands produce adrenaline as well as a bunch of other hormones. There is one adrenal gland sitting atop each of the kidneys. There are a set of hormones that are released by the outer part of the adrenal gland called the cortex, and then another bunch of hormones that are produced by the inner part of the adrenal gland called the adrenal gland medulla. The pancreas is also classified as an endocrine organ, and remember that we had earlier classified it as a digestive organ because in its digestive functions, the pancreas produces bicarbonate as well as digestive enzymes, proteases, lipidases, and so on, and it deposits those digestive enzymes as well as the bicarbonate into the duodenum. But it also has an endocrine function where it secretes two peptide hormones. One is called insulin and one is called glucagon. And these two these two hormones determine how much glucose is in your bloodstream, and the amount of glucose in your bloodstream is controlled homeotically. And so the pancreas is involved in the homeotic control of the amount of glucose that you find in your blood. And finally, the gonads, those are the testes in men and the ovaries in women. The gonads are classified as being part of the reproductive system, obviously, but they're also classified as being part of the endocrine system because the testes and the ovaries also release sex hormones that are usually, these sex hormones determine our body shape. You know that men and women have different shapes of bodies, and that's determined mainly by the hormones that are secreted by the gonads during adolescence when we're teenagers. So the gonads obviously produce what are called gametocytes. Gametocytes are the eggs or the sperm for women or men respectively, and they are also classified as endocrine organs because they secrete sex hormones that determine whether you develop into a male or a female. Examples are the progesterone is produced by and released by the ovaries in women, whereas testosterone is a hormone that's produced by the testes in men. And then, as always, we'll finish the lecture with some endocrine system pathologies. All right, so we've discussed this term before, but what does gene regulation mean? The term gene regulation refers to turning genes on or off. You know that we have 23,000 different genes. We have 2 copies of each. All 23,000 genes, 2 copies of each, are present in every cell, but all 23,000 genes are not being used by every cell. So there's a very complicated process that's employed to turn genes on and off. And some of those mechanisms that are involved in turning genes on and off, some of the mechanisms that are involved in gene regulation are hormone signaling. So hormones are a signal that's sent from one cell to another, telling another cell to turn a bunch of genes on or turn a bunch of genes off that cause some change to happen in the body. And therefore, hormones are one of the many mechanisms that we can use. The secretion of hormones and the receiving of hormones is one of the many mechanisms that we can use to control bodily functions. Okay, now the hormones are generally secreted by endocrine glands, and endocrine glands, remember when we discussed the different types of we discussed histology, we discussed the different types of tissues in the body, and we said that you will find cuboidal epithelium. You will usually find cuboidal epithelial cells lining the ducts of endocrine glands, which means that hormones are usually produced by cuboidal epithelial cells, specifically the cuboidal epithelial cells that are lining the ducts of endocrine glands. And remember that a duct is a little tube. All right, as we said, there are several different types of hormones. The lipid hormones. Lipid hormones are generally made by modifying cholesterol. Right? So if you add a few ornaments to cholesterol, you will have converted cholesterol into one of many different types of steroid hormones that exist. So I'm sure you've heard the term steroid hormones a lot. Steroid hormones are the lipid hormones. They're the biggest class of lipid hormones. So the steroid hormones are made from modified cholesterol, and generally if you need hormone therapy of some sort, if you need hormones, your doctor can prescribe pills to replace steroid hormones. Doctor cannot prescribe pills that you take through your mouth and stomach for peptide hormones because peptides are small proteins. And like any protein including a peptide hormone will be taken apart in your stomach by pepsin. You know, you take a peptide hormone into your stomach and your stomach thinks, aha, good, food, I'll destroy this, I'll hydrolyze it with pepsin. And so you cannot take peptide hormones by pill. You usually have to inject them. The most obvious example is insulin. Diabetics are lacking insulin, and they have to inject themselves with insulin several times a day. So that's having diabetes is not for somebody who is afraid of needles, because you have to poke yourself with a needle many times a day if you have diabetes. Okay, there are some hormones that are made from modified amino acids. Where you just take an amino acid and you add a couple of extra decorations to it, and you've created a signaling molecule, a type of hormone. All right, now 2 other little terms. The term cytokine usually refers to peptide hormones that work over short distances, and cytokines are usually involved in causing differentiation of the hematopoietic stem cells. So turning bone marrow stem cells into erythrocytes or other things, granulocytes, is something that's accomplished through the action of cytokines, these little peptide hormones. And some of the cytokines are additionally classified as being interleukins. So interleukins are little peptide hormones that are transmitted over short distances between white blood cells, and white blood cells, of course, are called leukocytes. So interleukin literally translates as between white blood cells. All right, so just a word about steroid hormones. Because lipids are generally hydrophobic, you know that from the first week of this class, they do not dissolve in the blood plasma. So steroid hormones are produced by a number of different endocrine organs, but they cannot be carried, they cannot dissolve in the blood and be transported through the blood by themselves. They actually have to be carried through the blood by soluble carrier proteins. So there are a number of different soluble carrier proteins whose job it is to carry the hormones through the blood. But once they reach their destination, once they reach the cell that they're supposed to reach, they can actually penetrate the plasma membrane by themselves, because cholesterol is soluble in the lipid membrane. So the carrier protein will bring a steroid hormone to the cell surface for the cell that it's supposed to go to, and then just leave it there. And then the steroid hormone will actually penetrate the plasma membrane of the cell all by itself. It's usually carried by another molecule to the nucleus. It's able to penetrate the nuclear membrane by itself. And then the steroid hormones generally make contact with a special type of transcription factor, a special type of protein in the nucleus that is referred to as a nuclear receptor. So steroid hormones do not meet with receptors on the cell surface. That's something that peptide hormones do, but steroid hormones generally don't do that. Steroid hormones are delivered to the surface of the cell by carrier proteins, and then they penetrate the cell by themselves. They get into the nucleus by themselves, and then they attach themselves to a protein in the nucleus whose job it is to increase transcription from one gene or another gene, and those things are called nuclear receptors. So nuclear receptors are proteins that are inactive, that are found in the nucleus, and they are inactive. And when they bind, when a specific hormone binds to these nuclear receptors, they have a change in shape, which causes them to bind to the genes that the target genes that they are intending to turn on or turn off. All right, peptide hormones are a little bit different. So they're a small protein, and also amino acids are in this category. They are usually very hydrophilic, so they dissolve well in the blood plasma. They don't need to be carried by carrier proteins, but they do not penetrate the cell plasma membrane. Instead, they interact with things called receptors that are on the surface of the cell. You'll learn more about this in other biology courses, but generally when you have a receptor on the surface of a cell, whatever the hormone is that is supposed to bind to that receptor, it might be a hormone, or it might be a cytokine, or it might be an interleukin, whatever the thing is that is supposed to interact and stimulate that receptor is generally called a ligand. So the word ligand is the general term for whatever it is that binds to the receptor that we're talking about. Okay, so once a cytokine or a peptide hormone interacts with or binds to the cell surface receptor that it's meant to bind to, remember that the cell surface receptors are very specific. So I said earlier that erythropoietin is classified as a peptide hormone. Erythropoietin will only bind to something called the erythropoietin receptor, which is abbreviated EPOR. Erythropoietin EPO will only bind to a receptor on the surface that is found on the surface of hematopoietic stem cells, and that receptor is referred to as the erythropoietin receptor. So if you're a cell that doesn't have an erythropoietin receptor on its surface, you cannot be stimulated by erythropoietin, so you don't have to worry about it. All right, but once the specific peptide hormone or the specific amino acid hormone or the specific cytokine or growth factor or interleukin binds to this receptor that it's meant to bind to, it will stimulate that receptor, and that receptor will set off a cascade or a kind of a relay race inside the cell where the signal is transmitted from the receptor on the outside to another molecule on the inside. That molecule will stimulate another molecule, which stimulates another molecule, which eventually relays the signal to the nucleus. And the process of relaying signals from receptors on the surface all the way to genes in the nucleus is a branch of biology that's referred to as signal transduction. So signal transduction refers to a kind of basically relaying a signal from the cell surface to the nucleus. That's called signal transduction. All right, endocrine glands produce hormones and send them to other parts of the body. Now we have to make a distinction between two major types of hormones based on their function. We've already distinguished between types of hormones that are made out of lipids versus proteins or amino acids. Now let's distinguish between two types of hormones based on what they do. A tropic hormone, very important word. A tropic hormone is a hormone that controls, it's a hormone that is produced by an endocrine organ, and its function is to stimulate another endocrine organ to produce other hormones. Right? So if hormones control what the body does, or what certain parts of the body do, then tropic hormones are the ones that control what the hormones do, what the endocrine glands do. So tropic hormones are hormones that are produced by sort of superior endocrine glands that have the purpose of controlling inferior endocrine glands, subordinate endocrine glands. Right? So, for example, the pituitary gland in the brain produces something called thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is, thyroid stimulating hormone. So the pituitary gland produces a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to produce another hormone called thyroid hormone. So thyroid stimulating hormone is a tropic hormone because its target is to stimulate the thyroid gland, which is also classified as an endocrine organ, and the thyroid gland also produces hormones. And so a hormone that causes another endocrine organ to release hormones or produce hormones is referred to as a tropic hormone. So we have to draw a distinction between tropic hormones versus regular hormones. All right, now I mentioned we subclassify hormones based on how big is the distance over which they act. All right, so an endocrine hormone is where you send out signals, you send out the hormone into the blood and it travels a long distance to stimulate cells somewhere on the other side of the body, for instance. Paracrine signaling is where a cell sends out a hormone that is meant to stimulate another cell that's local, that is nearby, usually sends out the hormone into the interstitial fluid as opposed to the blood, where endocrine organs are sending hormones out into the bloodstream. Finally, autocrine signaling is where a cell produces a hormone that stimulates itself, and it's able to do this because the cell actually has a receptor on its surface that is designed to receive the signal that the cell itself is producing. So that is one way for a cell to control what it does. It's kind of an inefficient way to control what it does, but nevertheless, there are some cells that actually do that. Finally, there is something called neuroendocrine signaling. This is where this is where neurons, usually in the brain, send a signal to an endocrine organ telling the endocrine organ to release hormones. So the best example of that, of course, is the hypothalamus stimulating the pituitary gland to release hormones. The hypothalamus, as you remember from the section on neurology that we did, the hypothalamus is officially part of the brain, and it's made of neurons. Sitting just underneath the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland, which is an endocrine gland, which contains Instead of containing neurological cells, instead of containing neurological tissue, it's made out of epithelial tissue. So it has ducts that are lined with cuboidal epithelial tissue that produce hormones that are sent out into the body. So that's an example. The hypothalamus stimulating the pituitary gland to do things is the best example of neuroendocrine signaling. All right, let's look at all of the major endocrine organs in the body. We're not going to go through all of them, but we'll go through the major ones. So we're going to go through the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland, all of which are present in the head. The hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland, and then we'll go through the thyroid and the parathyroid glands, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, and the gonads, which are located below the head in the body. Beginning with the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus is located here, right? So you remember the thalamus is up here, and then the hypothalamus is located down below. And the hypothalamus is responsible for stimulating the pituitary gland to release dozens of different hormones under dozens of different circumstances. You may remember that we said that the hypothalamus contains Osmo receptors. Osmo receptors are specialized neurons that are able to sense how salty the blood is. So as blood is traveling sort of around the brain and being converted into cerebrospinal fluid, these Osmo receptors are able to sense how much salt is in the cerebrospinal fluid, and then by extension that tells you how much salt is in the blood serum. And then if the serum is too salty, the hypothalamus assumes it's because you've lost water, and it releases the hormone antidiuretic hormone, which goes to the kidneys and tells the kidneys to retain more water, thus increasing the blood volume and usually increasing the blood pressure that way. Okay, so the hypothalamus is sort of classified as part of the endocrine system, but it is part of the neurological system as well, the nervous system as well. All right, now below the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland what to do. Right, so I just mentioned the fact that the hypothalamus contains Osmo receptors that sense how salty the blood is by sensing how salty the serum is. And then it tells the pituitary gland to release vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone, causing the kidneys to retain more water. Okay, so the pituitary gland is located just underneath the hypothalamus. It's about the size of a pea. It's a very small organ, but it secretes dozens of different hormones. Many of them are tropic hormones. So the pituitary gland secretes so many hormones that it's easier for us to learn them all if we divide the pituitary gland into the anterior pituitary gland versus the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, of the hormones that we're going to learn that memorize these hormones coming out of the posterior pituitary gland, we're only going to memorize two of them. One of them you already know, which is vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone, which tells the kidneys to put more aquaporin channels into the collecting ducts of each nephridia and thus retain more water. The other one that we're going to learn about, which is new, is called oxytocin. And oxytocin causes two things to happen. Number one, when a woman is giving birth, during childbirth, it causes the muscles around the uterus being here, of course, containing the baby, causes the muscles around the uterus to contract and squeeze the baby out during childbirth. So that's a function of oxytocin. And in addition to that, at other times that are not during childbirth but related to babies and childbirth, oxytocin is a hormone that also causes the mammary glands or the breasts to secrete milk, which is called lactation. Lactose is the main sugar that you find in milk, and so therefore, as I'm sure you know, when a woman is not pregnant or has not given birth recently, the breasts are not producing milk. Right, so the breasts, but just before childbirth and for a few months after childbirth, the breasts swell up and begin to lactate and have the ability to produce milk. So that is called lactation, and that's something that's caused by oxytocin. But remember that the oxytocin only causes the milk to be secreted, not produced. Right? So production of milk is controlled by another hormone, which we'll talk about in a minute. Right? So oxytocin, two functions: uterine contractions to squeeze the baby out during childbirth. You can induce artificial labor, like if a woman is having a hard time giving birth, they give her an artificial version of oxytocin to cause the baby to come out at a specific time. That's called induction of birth, induction of labor. And the second function is secretion of milk, but not necessarily production of milk. Production of milk is caused by another, production of milk is caused by another hormone. All right, now let's look at the hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and we're going to learn quite a few of these. Okay, so first, the thyroid stimulating hormone, abbreviated TSH, is released, and when it's released from the pituitary gland is up here, of course, it stimulates the thyroid gland in your throat to secrete thyroid hormone. Right? So thyroid stimulating hormone is obviously a tropic hormone. Next, adrenocorticotropic hormone, abbreviated ACTH. Remember, I said it's easier to memorize these names. These names look like they're ridiculously hard, but in fact, you can memorize it in parts. Okay, so the word adreno refers to the adrenal gland. Cortico refers to the fact that this hormone stimulates the adrenal gland cortex to release hormones, and tropic means that it's a tropic hormone because the adrenal glands are considered to be endocrine organs as well. So whenever you have one hormone telling another endocrine gland what to do, we refer to that as a tropic hormone. So adrenocorticotropic hormone is obviously a tropic hormone. It's right in the name. So adrenal gland, cortico, the adrenal gland cortex, tropic hormone, stimulates the adrenal gland to secrete hormones, and we'll talk specifically about which hormones it causes the adrenal gland to secrete, but it is actually causing the hormones to be secreted from the cortex of the adrenal gland. There's another set of hormones that are secreted by the medulla of the adrenal gland. All right, next, follicle stimulating hormone is involved in the production of gametes or haploid gametes by the gonads. So a gamete is a haploid cell. Remember that a haploid cell is a cell that has only one of each gene instead of two. So humans are diploid. But when humans produce sperms or unfertilized eggs in males and females respectively, those are called gametes. It has to do with game theory. Game theory, when you take things apart and put them back together in a different order. So gametes are, in humans and other mammals, the gametes are the haploid reproductive cells, specifically sperms and unfertilized eggs. Okay, so those gametes are produced by structures called follicles that are found, particularly the eggs, unfertilized eggs, called ova, which are produced by women. They're produced inside a structure called a follicle. So it has nothing to do with hair follicles per se. It has to do with the follicles that produce eggs in female ovaries. And they also cause the ovaries to release certain hormones, in this case estradiol, which is a female hormone. And we'll talk about what estradiol does a little bit later. Okay, now luteinizing hormone, or LH, it's a hormone that's produced by the pituitary gland, which stimulates the gonads again to produce either male hormones, which are known as androgens. Androgens are a group of hormones that are produced by the male testes and cause men to develop into men. If you look at boys and girls before adolescence, obviously they have different genitals, they have different sex organs, but the body shape of a boy versus a girl is very similar until they hit puberty, until they reach adolescence. And then during adolescence, the body shapes diverge quite dramatically, and that's because of that's because of androgens being produced by the testes in men, or the estrogens being produced in the ovaries of women. And one of the estrogens is a hormone called progesterone, which we'll talk about later. So luteinizing hormone is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and it is involved in determining the male versus the female body shape during adolescence, and it is also involved in regulation of ovulation in women. Ovulation, of course, is menstruation, where women produce one egg every month, which is available to be fertilized. That is also controlled by luteinizing hormone and also by follicle stimulating hormone. So we're going to talk about that later on. Okay, so all of these are tropic hormones. Right, so the thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is an endocrine gland, so this is a tropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal glands, which are also classified as endocrine glands, so that's a tropic hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone stimulate the gonads, the testes and the ovaries. The testes and the ovaries are both classified as endocrine glands, and so follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are also tropic hormones. All right, let's look at some hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary gland that are not tropic hormones. Number one, growth hormone, abbreviated GH, is responsible for elongation of the long bones in the arms and legs during adolescence, right? So if you have a lack of growth hormone, you could end up being a dwarf. You could be dwarfed in size because during adolescence the humerus and the femur and the tibula and the radius and the ulna and the fibula do not elongate the way they do normally if you have a lack of growth hormone. So growth hormone causes us to grow tall during adolescence. Next, we mentioned this before. The other hormone that is actually responsible for production of milk rather than release of milk is called prolactin, and it is produced by the anterior pituitary gland, but the breast is, the target organ is the breast, the mammary glands, but the mammary glands are not considered, they're not classified as endocrine organs. They're actually classified as exocrine glands because milk is produced in the breast and then delivered out of the breast through a tube that comes out of the front of the breast. And so it is classified as an exocrine organ. So the hormone that stimulates the mammary glands is not stimulating an endocrine organ, therefore it is not classified as a tropic hormone. Okay, melanocyte stimulating hormone stimulates the melanocytes in the epidermal layer of the skin. Remember that in response to sunlight, you have melanocytes in the top epidermal layer that produces a brown pigment called melanin, not to be confused with melatonin, which is a hormone that's produced by the pineal gland. But melanocytes, so when you go out into the sun and the sun stimulates the melanocytes in your skin to produce a brown pigment called melanin so that you get a suntan or your skin turns darker, the melanin actually is there to protect your cells from the ultraviolet rays damaging your DNA. That's why if you have people with fair skin that go out into harsh sunlight, they tend to catch skin cancer more easily than people who have darker skin going out in the sunlight. So melanin is there to protect you from skin cancer if you're out in the harsh sun. If your ancestors lived in an environment where the sun is not very strong, like in the northern climates of Europe and so on, eventually evolution says, well, we don't really need this. If it disappears, it doesn't matter. So that's how dark skin versus fair skin evolved. But melanocyte stimulating hormone is the hormone that actually causes the melanocytes in the skin to produce melanin, the pigment. And once again, don't confuse melanin, which is a pigment. The word pigment means a colored chemical, colored. So don't confuse melanin, which is a pigment, with melatonin, which is a hormone that makes us sleepy. All right, just an example, growth hormone, if you have too little of it during adolescence, you would be a dwarf. If you have too much of it, like this guy has, we'll talk about him later, you end up growing fantastically tall. So this is a regular sized man over here, and then this is a giant man who had unfortunately, a malfunctioning pituitary gland, anterior pituitary gland, so he just kept on growing. Okay, if you don't have enough growth hormone during adolescence, you would end up developing something called pituitary dwarfism. This girl named Charlotte Garside is, I believe she's 7 years old there, but she's quite small because it's not actually because her pituitary gland is not producing growth hormone, it's because the cells didn't have any receptors. There's a mutation to the receptors for growth hormone in this very rare example of pituitary dwarfism. But generally these days, if somebody's pituitary gland is not producing enough growth hormone, you can compensate by giving them pills. So you just give them pills, and then the problem is solved. Unfortunately for Charlotte Garside, she doesn't have that problem. She has a slightly related, a different but related problem, which is that the cells that are meant to receive the growth hormone don't have the receptor. Don't confuse pituitary dwarfism with something called achondroplasia. Achondroplasia is another type of dwarfism completely. So here we have an actor named Peter Dinklage, who was a star of Game of Thrones. He is one of many people who have something called achondroplasia, which is another genetic disease and genetic disorder entirely. Okay, so all of these are the hormones that are produced by the pituitary gland. All of these are produced by the anterior side of the pituitary gland. All of these are produced by the posterior side. Can you guess, or do you remember already which ones are tropic and which ones are not? You can stop the recording here and see if you can remember. These are the tropic hormones. All right, let's move on to the pineal gland. The pineal gland is located in the brain as well. It's located posterior to the pituitary gland. Now, interestingly, the pineal gland produces a hormone called melatonin that makes you sleepy. A little bit of light can actually diffuse through the back of your eyes and get into the brain. So the brain does actually physically get a little bit of light. And that light is actually able to inhibit the pineal gland from producing melatonin. And so that's why you can't sleep when it's light. You need darkness to go to sleep. That's one of many functions that humans have that follow something called a circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythm, or a biorhythm, refers to the fact that we evolved. All life on Earth, life has been on Earth for 3.5 billion years, and during all of that time we have had a 24-hour day-night cycle where, and then near the equator, the Earth spends about 12 hours in the light, 12 hours in the dark. It stands to reason that after 3.5 billion years of evolution, our bodies and the bodies of all of the animals and plants that have evolved would start responding to the fact that it's light sometimes and it's dark sometimes. Right, so those are referred to as circadian rhythms generally, and so there are a number of body functions that follow a circadian rhythm and respond whether it's light or dark. And in this case, the pineal gland producing melatonin in response to darkness versus not producing melatonin in response to light is an example of a circadian rhythm. All right, now if you have trouble sleeping when it's light outside, you can wear a sleep mask like we see here on the left. Right? But you can also, if you work shift work, for instance, let's say you're a nurse or something, nurses have this brutal work schedule where they have to be awake for, they work from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. 2 days a week, then they get a day off, then they work from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. for the next 2 days. That's terrible on your sleeping waking schedule. It messes up your waking sleeping cycle. Your circadian rhythm is badly damaged by that. So sometimes people who work shift work, they simply take melatonin pills, which can be bought over the counter to modify their circadian rhythms. Pilots do the same thing. Let's say you're a pilot and you're flying an airplane back and forth from New York to Paris or from New York to Moscow every other week. Suddenly you find yourself in Moscow and you're wide awake at 3 o'clock in the morning because it's 12 noon in New York. What are you going to do? You want to go to sleep, so you take some melatonin pills. That is one thing that happens. Melatonin used to be a prescription-only drug. It is a drug. Now you can buy it over the counter, which is kind of unfortunate because it used to be a prescription-only drug, because whenever you have drugs that are sold over the counter, you run the possibility of people abusing those drugs. And what happens if you take too much melatonin as a pill, what happens with any of the endocrine organs is that if you take that hormone as a pill or an injection, the organ that produces that hormone basically will start to atrophy. Atrophy means it will wither away and disappear or get smaller because it's become it isn't really needed anymore. Right? So basically, if you take too many melatonin pills, your pineal gland gets insulted and says, well, if you're obviously getting your melatonin somewhere else, you don't even need me, do you? And then it just basically shrinks and disappears, and then you have a lot of trouble regulating your circadian rhythm naturally. Another thing is that for some people, melatonin has a side effect of giving you nightmares, but that's apparently only happens to some people. I know that I used to suffer from insomnia, and I used to take melatonin pills, and I decided to stop doing it because I would have terrible nightmares. I'd get to sleep at night, and I'd wake up physically refreshed, but I'd wake up emotionally traumatized by all these nightmares that I was having, so I stopped. So that is something that happens to some people. Moving on to the thyroid gland, it's located right here underneath the larynx, pressed up against the thyroid cartilage. And the thyroid, notice that the thyroid has two distinct lobes. There's a left and a right lobe. And the piece in the middle that's holding them together is called an isthmus. The TH is silent. It's called an isthmus. So an isthmus refers to something that joins two larger pieces, right? So for instance, the country of Panama that occupies that narrow little space that separates separates the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans is referred to as the Isthmus of Panama. Okay, so we have an isthmus that's joining or connecting or dividing, if you want to put it that way, the left and right lobe of the thyroid gland. And then if you take the thyroid gland out and you look at the posterior side of it, on the back side of the thyroid gland, you'll see four little tiny pea-sized organs, which are referred to as the parathyroid glands. Right? So the thyroid, we have the thyroid gland, and on the posterior side of the thyroid gland, we have four little parathyroid glands. Okay, so first of all, don't confuse the thyroid with the thymus. The two words sound very similar, but of course the thymus is part of the immune system. It's where the T helper cells become educated and learn the difference between your tissues and other tissues, right? So the thyroid gland is controlled by the anterior pituitary gland when it produces thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so the thyroid gland actually produces two hormones that we're going to learn the names of. Thyroid hormone is produced in response to the pituitary gland stimulating the thyroid gland with thyroid stimulating hormone, and thyroid hormone has the effect of increasing your general metabolic rate. Now you know that glucose is broken down in mitochondria. Whenever you break down, you're converting the energy that's released by the breakdown of glucose, you're converting that into ATP. Whenever you convert one form of energy into another, a general rule is that you will waste half of that energy in the conversion process. So when you break down glucose and then use the energy that's released to create ATP, you generally waste about half of the energy that was contained in the glycosidic bonds of glucose. And that energy, generally when you waste energy in a conversion like that, the energy is wasted in the form of heat. Therefore, it stands to reason that if your mitochondria are burning more glucose, your mitochondria are metabolizing and breaking down more glucose, your body temperature will go up. So one of the the production of thyroid hormone has two effects. Number one is it gives you it burns, it causes it causes the breakdown of glucose to accelerate, so you generally have more energy, right? So thyroid hormone gives you energy. Secondly, because you're breaking down more glucose, you're burning more glucose, you're generating more heat, so your body temperature tends to go up. Right, so thyroid hormone increases the general metabolic rate, the general breakdown of glucose by mitochondria all over the body, and causes you to have more energy because you're burning more glucose, and it also causes your body temperature to go up because the burning of glucose is inefficient and it releases a lot of energy as heat. Okay, next, calcitonin. This is involved in bone remodeling. So we learned about this when we were discussing the bones. So the calcitonin, I suggested that you memorize calcitonin by saying to yourself, calcitone in, calcitone in. And calcitonin causes calcium to be put into the bones, to be absorbed by the bones and increase the bone mass, increase. Right, so calcitonin is produced by the thyroid gland, and it causes calcium to be taken out of the blood and put into the bone. Calcitonin is part of the homeostatic control over the amount of calcium in the blood. Many of the enzymes all over the body and all of the cells use calcium as a cofactor. That means it's a prosthetic group. So many of the enzymes, calcium is used in many of the reactions that take place in the cells because the enzymes that are catalyzing those reactions need it. And so, so we need to have a lot of calcium in our blood. We need to have a certain amount of calcium circulating around our body in the blood in order for the cells to use it. But the amount of calcium that is circulating in the blood is controlled homeostatically by calcitonin, and also the other side of the coin is parathyroid hormone, which causes calcium to be released from the bones. Okay, so calcitonin, one side of the coin for bone remodeling, is produced by the thyroid hormone. By the thyroid gland, I meant. Okay, so parathyroid glands are located on the posterior side, and they produce only one hormone called parathyroid hormone, which causes an increase in the calcium concentration in the blood because it causes calcium to be released from the bone. If you have too much calcium leaving the bone matrix density will go down, and then you have osteoporosis. So you can sort of take pills, you can take calcitonin pills if you have this problem to try and encourage more of the calcium to go back into the bone. But control of calcium in the bone is controlled by calcitonin on the one hand, which causes the calcium to go in, and parathyroid hormone, which causes calcium to come out of the bones. All right, so bone remodeling. Calcitonin, produced by the thyroid gland, causes calcium to be taken into the bone, making the bone stronger. And parathyroid hormone, produced by the parathyroid glands on the posterior side of the thyroid gland, causes the bones to become weaker because it takes calcium out of the bone and puts it into the blood. Osteoporosis, we talked about that. It's when the mass of your bone matrix drops below 50% of what it was during peak bone mass. Remember that peak bone mass is the bone mass, the maximum bone density that you ever have, and most people reach peak bone mass around 5 years after they stop growing vertically. Right, so I, for instance, I was as tall when I was 16 as I am now. So I stopped growing vertically when I was 16. That means I had maximum bone mass when I was about 21, and I've been releasing bone mass at a rate of about, losing bone mass at a rate of about 1 or 2% a year ever since. So my bones are getting down to like 70% or something like that of their peak bone mass. Right, so here we have osteoporosis where the bone matrix is badly depleted and the pores in between the bone matrix in the spongy bone has diminished. And when that happens to you, the bones are easily broken. And as I mentioned during the bone sections of this course, that's exactly why we always have to be careful with older people, because they can easily break bones because they're losing bone matter every year. So by the time you're 60 or 70 or 80, you've lost a significant amount of your bone matrix. And your bones, not only can your bones be easily broken, but it takes they may never heal properly, because not only is the bone easily broken, but it doesn't repair itself as well either. So that's why we always have seats on the bus that are meant to be reserved for elderly people, because if an elderly person stands, if a young person is forced to stand on a crowded bus and the bus lurches to a stop, and you fall over, you hit your hip on the floor, you get a bruise, and the bruise is fine after a week. But if an elderly person is standing on the bus and the bus lurches to a stop and then they hit the floor, they may break their hip and it will never heal again. And as you know, the process of going from being a relatively healthy young person to an older elderly person who's badly disabled, can't walk properly, has trouble walking and so on, requires a cane. Those things, the transition from a functional person to a person who's having trouble functioning, takes place in a series of events. And so breaking a bone is a very significant event when you're older, because it may never heal properly, and then you have a disability for the rest of your life related to that bone breakage. All right, let's look on to the adrenal glands now. So as I said, the adrenal gland has a cortex, the outer part, and it has a medulla, the inner part. And each adrenal gland is located atop one of the kidneys. So we have two of them. All right, the adrenal cortex produces long-term stress, what are referred to as long-term stress hormones. Stress hormones meaning you're leading a stressful lifestyle, you're under pressure, you're worried all the time, you're having to work all the time, things like that. That causes stress. And in response to that, your adrenal gland cortex produces some hormones that modify your body, and we'll talk about that. The long-term stress hormones are generally slow acting, because now remember, these are produced by the adrenal gland cortex. And so which hormone comes out of the pituitary gland and tells the cortex to produce hormones? It was adrenocorticotropic hormone, wasn't it? So the release of these hormones from the adrenal cortex, the long-term stress hormones, is a relatively slow process, because it involves releasing adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary gland, and that hormone has to travel down through the blood until it reaches the adrenal gland cortex. So it's not an instantaneous response. Okay, now the adrenal gland medulla produces short-term stress hormones, which are involved in the fight or flight response. Right? So if your little brother sneaks up behind you wearing a monster mask and scares you, you turn around, you're terrified for an instant, and then your heart rate goes up, your breathing increases, you're prepared to fight or flight, your flesh turns cold because the blood has been diverted away from the skin surface by the precapillary sphincters. And then it takes you a minute for you to calm down again, but you calm down again. So the scaredness, being terrified, was instantaneous. It happened instantly, and the adrenal gland medulla produces hormones such as adrenaline, which is also known as epinephrine, which has this effect. It causes the heart rate to go up. It causes the respiratory rate to increase. It causes blood to be diverted away from the digestive organs in the skin and diverted towards the heart and the lungs and the limbs, the muscles that you need to fight or run away, right? And that happens instantaneously. And so then when the terror and the fear goes away, or the danger goes away, basically, you calm down again. So these are hormones that are invoked instantly, and then they disappear. When the danger disappears, they disappear quite rapidly. And the reason why they can respond so quickly is because neurons are connected directly from your brain to the adrenal gland medulla. So when you see something scary, your brain immediately sends signals down through these white matter neurons down the spinal column, sends them directly to the adrenal gland medulla, causing you to have short-term stress hormone, the fight or flight response. Okay, let's look at the specific hormones that are released from the adrenal gland cortex. Again, this is endocrine signaling. So the adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete one class of hormones that are referred to as the glucocorticoids. This is a group of hormones. And the glucocorticoids, they break down fat to release the energy. Right, if you're constantly producing glucocorticoids, you tend to be thinner, because your your adrenal gland cortex is producing the glucocorticoids, which break down the adipose tissue and release the energy. The body says, well, you're in some kind of a constant stressful situation. You're probably having to work hard, or you're worried about things, and so you need more energy. So you're breaking down the adipose tissue to release extra energy. But they also have a different effect, which is to suppress the immune system. So when during the Christmas exam, or during the April exam, the Easter exam period, you may have noticed that people are sitting around in the classroom writing exams. Everybody's sick. Everyone is sniffling or sneezing. Everyone seems to have a cold during exam week. And that is not your imagination. That's true. People tend to get sicker easy. The reason why all these people are catching colds during exam season is because they're under stress. And when you're under constant stress, you produce glucocorticoids. This causes a suppression of the immune system. And so it is more easy for you to get sick. You're easily made sick if you are under constant stress. The other thing is that, remember that the inflammatory response, when we discussed the immune system, we said that inflammation is a function of the immune system. And if the glucocorticoids suppress the immune system, they will also suppress inflammation. Now, what are the characteristics of inflammation again? Remember, there are 4 of them. Do you remember what they are? We have redness, a sensation of heat, swelling, and what's the 4th one? Pain. Right, so many of the pains, many of the little aches and pains that we get in our body as we get older are caused by chronic inflammation of some part of the body. For example, carpal tunnel syndrome. Carpal tunnel syndrome happens because you have bad typing posture and you're resting your wrists on the desk or something, like I catch myself doing all the time. And that pressure on the medial nerve that runs through the carpal tunnel, that is caused because the tendons inside the carpal tunnel are inflamed and swollen up. So they may give you a cream called hydrocortisone to rub on it, which relieves the swelling and therefore stops pinching if the swelling of the tendons goes down, then the medial nerve stops being pinched. And so when you pinch a nerve, if you compress a nerve, it often results in pain. Right, so the hydrocortisone cream will take the swelling down in the carpal tunnel, and then the medial nerve will stop being pinched or compressed, and it won't hurt anymore. Okay, so these corticosteroids, one example that I need you to memorize, we'll just memorize one example of each of these hormones. So cortisol is one of the glucocorticoids. So cortisol is produced by the adrenal gland cortex in response to constant stress, but it also has the effect of suppressing the immune system or suppressing any inflammation around the body. And so as a result of that, the pharmaceutical industry has learned how to manufacture a synthetic version of cortisol, which is called hydrocortisone. This is a cream that you rub on if you have a sore shoulder, or if you have a chronically sore shoulder, or a chronically sore knee, or carpal tunnel syndrome, or something like that. You can either rub a cream onto the surface, or you can get an injection of cortisol directly into the joint that's hurting, and that will take the swelling down if the swelling has been caused by inflammation, by chronic inflammation. So hydrocortisone is an example of a drug that mimics. It's a synthetic version of cortisol. Cortisol is an adrenal gland cortex hormone that has the effect of suppressing the immune system, including suppression of inflammation. All right, what about the other class? The other class that's visible here on the page are the mineralocorticoids. The mineralocorticoids cause your kidneys to retain more salt, which has the effect of increasing the blood pressure. And the one that we learned about already is called aldosterone. Right, so aldosterone is one of the mineralocorticoids that causes your kidneys to retain more salt. If your kidneys retain more salt, that causes your pituitary gland to release more antidiuretic hormone, which causes you to retain more water. And that in turn causes your blood pressure to go up. So that is why people who are constantly living a stressful lifestyle, they're constantly under emotional stress, tend to have high blood pressure. They tend to have hypotension. Okay, so there are two classes of adrenal gland cortex hormones that we're learning about, the glucocorticoids and the mineralocorticoids, and we learned an example of each one of those. All right, the adrenal gland medulla secretes hormones quickly because the signal comes directly. It's an example of neuroendocrine signaling directly from the brain. The response is very fast. So if you get scared by something, your body will be prepared for fight or flight. One of the hormones that's released by the adrenal gland medulla is called epinephrine. The common name for epinephrine is adrenaline because it's produced by the adrenal gland. But the technically correct word for it is epinephrine. There's another one called norepinephrine, which is similar. You don't have to memorize that one, but you should memorize epinephrine. And epinephrine, of course, increases the heart rate, increases the respiratory rate, diverts blood away from the digestive organs, and prepares the body for fight or flight. And that is released from the adrenal gland medulla in direct response to a signal from the brain. All right, here we have the pancreas located behind the stomach. We've already learned about the function of the pancreas in digestion. The pancreas also produces two hormones that are involved with the metabolic homeostatic control of glucose in the blood. All right, so the digestive functions of the pancreas are known. We discussed that before. Now let's look at regulation. Let's look at the endocrine function of the pancreas. It's involved in the homeostatic control of how much glucose is in the blood. And in response to that, it produces two different hormones. One of them is called insulin, which causes glucose to be converted into glycogen, and which is then stored in the cells, including the muscle fibers and also in the liver. Right? So insulin has the effect of lowering the blood glucose level by causing the conversion of glucose to glycogen, and then storing the glycogen in the liver and the muscles. Glucagon has the effect of increasing the amount of glycogen in the blood by converting glycogen back into glucose and putting it into the blood. Right? So when do you think the levels of glucose in your blood would be the highest? I'll let you stop the recording if you want to think about that. Right. Okay, obviously the levels of glucose in your blood will be highest just after you've eaten. When do you think the levels of glucose in your blood would be the lowest? You can think about that for a minute. All right, obviously the levels of glucose will be lowest the longer it's been since you've eaten. So during a period of prolonged fasting, usually your blood glucose levels are the lowest when you wake up in the morning because you haven't eaten for 8, 10, or 12 hours. Right. There is a way you can get around that. That's if you take if that has a severe effect on you, as it does with some people. What you can do is you can take cornstarch and you mix a spoonful of cornstarch with a glass of water and drink it. Cornstarch is a linear amylose linear polymer, so the glucose is released gradually and slowly while you're overnight, so that your blood glucose level never drops severely that way. So that's one way that you can get around that problem. But nevertheless, generally, the glucose levels in your blood are lowest when you wake up in the morning because it's been a long time since you've eaten. Okay, so then let me ask you this question. When do you think the levels of insulin would be highest in your blood? And the answer is right after you've eaten, because your blood glucose level goes up and then the insulin is produced in order to get rid of the excess. And by the reverse, the converse, if you have not eaten for a long time, the blood glucose levels will drop, and then the pancreas will produce glucagon, which causes the glycogen in the liver and in the muscles to be converted into glucose and put into the blood. You know, that, for instance, that there are some people called diabetics whose pancreas doesn't make insulin. These are specifically called type 1 diabetics because type 1 diabetes is where your pancreas doesn't actually make the insulin. So they actually have to inject insulin, and the insulin injection works best if you inject an amount of insulin that's proportional to the amount of glucose that's in your blood. So if you eat a lot of sugary foods and things like that, you'll have a lot of glucose in your blood right after eating. If you eat foods that are low in polysaccharides. Just if you just eat meat and cheese, for instance, you would have a lower level of glucose. So it's not necessary to inject the same amount of insulin. You actually, to be in peak health, to be in proper health, you have to tailor the amount of insulin to the amount of glucose that's in your blood. And one of the simplest ways to do that is to poke your finger with a pin. Then you take the pH of the blood, and then the pH of your blood will vary depending on how much glucose is there. So basically, people poke their fingers. Diabetics have to poke their fingers after an hour or so after they eat, and then take the pH of their blood to figure out how much insulin they have to inject. All right, now the treatment for diabetes, there has never been a cure for diabetes, but it can be treated by injecting people with insulin. Okay, so this is a course in a Canadian college. So we, as proper Canadians, should know who our national heroes are. And so one of the Canadian scientific national heroes was a man named Frederick Banting, who discovered insulin in 1921 and received the Nobel Prize for that in 1923. If there are any Romanians listening, I apologize, because I know that Romanians get very emotional about the fact that there was a Romanian scientist around the same time who discovered something similar. He discovered that extracts that are taken from the pancreas can lower blood sugar levels as well, and he didn't win the Nobel Prize, but it's not because nobody knew about his work. The Nobel Committee actually knew about his work, and it was mentioned in the preamble to the Frederick Banting Nobel Prize speech. So they did know about it. It's not that they didn't know about it. They just didn't. The Nobel Committee, which is based in Sweden and Norway, just didn't believe that the contribution was significant enough to warrant the Nobel Prize. But anyway, so Frederick Banting, along with a Canadian immigrant named John MacLeod, who immigrated from Scotland earlier. The two of them received the 1923 Nobel Prize for medicine for discovering insulin. Frederick Banting had the most to do with it. It's kind of an interesting story. I'll tell you if you're amused by anecdotal stories. But Frederick Banting was trained as a doctor. He was training to be a surgeon before the war, before World War I. And World War I broke out, and they needed doctors on the front line in Europe on the battlefield. So they accelerated the medical school training. And so they, instead of 4 years, they gave them 3 years of training and then kicked them out onto the front lines of the battlefields. And then when Frederick Banting came back from World War I, he wasn't terribly well trained and as a surgeon. So he was having trouble making a living as a surgeon. And so he got a job teaching biochemistry as a part-time instructor at the University of Toronto. And so he was basically reading the textbook one chapter ahead of the students. He didn't know any of this stuff himself, but he was teaching biochemistry even though he didn't feel qualified to teach biochemistry. And he learned about diabetes as he was teaching biochemistry. So if he'd been a good surgeon and had a good job as a surgeon, he wouldn't have had to take this part-time job. But he did have to take it, and he was forced to learn about biochemistry in detail that he wouldn't have learned otherwise. And then he said, well, you know, at the time, the people believed that there was something in the pancreas that had the ability to lower blood glucose levels. And what biochemists try to do when they try to isolate an active ingredient from something, an organ, for instance, what biochemists tend to do is they will grind up the organ and then they'll extract it using organic chemistry methods to try and purify the active ingredient. So the biochemists were busy trying to isolate the active ingredient from the spleen by grinding up spleens and then extracting them with alcohol and then resolubilizing them with water and then back extracting with acetone. And they were trying all of these many different extraction protocols, and they were not succeeding in isolating the active ingredient that was being produced by the pancreas. But Fred Banting, because of his background training as a surgeon, he knew that there was one set of arteries that supplied the acinar cells in the pancreas, and there was another set of arteries that supplied another structure called the islets of Langerhans. And so he knew that if you took a dog, for instance, and you tied off the arteries that supply the blood to the acinar cells, that part of the pancreas will wither away and disappear, and you will only be left with these other structures that are called the islets of Langerhans. And the belief was that the islets of Langerhans were producing the active ingredient that lowers blood pressure. So he went to John McLeod, who was a professor at the University of Toronto, a biochemistry professor, and he asked him if he could do some research in his lab, and McLeod said, yes, you can use my grant money and you can use my laboratory and to do this research. And so Banting took a bunch of dogs, and he took some dogs and he did surgery on the dogs and tied off the arteries that supply blood to the acinar cells. And then he took other dogs and he tied off the ducts he removed the pancreas entirely. And that's a way of creating an artificial diabetic dog. And then he took the pancreases out of the dogs where he tied off the ducts to the acinar cells, and all that was left of the pancreas really was the islets of Langerhans. And he ground up the islets of Langerhans, suspended it in water, injected it into the diabetic dogs, and the diabetes, their blood sugar level went down. And so he had succeeded in using a surgical method to do what the biochemists couldn't do, which was to purify the active ingredient from the pancreas. So Banting and McLeod got the 1923 Nobel Prize for that. There was a biochemistry student who was working with Frederick Banting named Charles Best, who was a student at the time, but he did a lot of the work, but he was not acknowledged by the Nobel Prize Committee either. Like, they said, oh, he's just a student, he couldn't have been doing anything important. So he kind of got ripped off by the fact that he wasn't named, he didn't get to share the Nobel Prize. So there's a big controversy over this. There was the fact that Banting and McLeod won the Nobel Prize and Charles Best didn't. Charles Best went on to become a very famous scientist in his own right. And then finally there was another scientist named James Collip, who was a biochemist who finally discovered a biochemical way to extract the insulin from the pancreas. And he was not included in the Nobel Prize either. So the people thought, well, this was kind of stupid. They should have given the Nobel Prize to all four of them, but they only gave it to Banting and McLeod, so they thought, no, that was controversial. But anyway, so Frederick Banting is one of Canada's scientific heroes because he was the first Canadian ever to win a Nobel Prize, and he won it for the discovery of insulin. All right, let's move on from that and talk about the gonads and the hormones that are produced by the gonads. All right, so these hormones are usually released in response to luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland. Right, so the testes in men release in males, starting with adolescence, release a group of hormones that are referred to as the androgens. And the androgens produce male secondary sexual characteristics. Right, male secondary sexual characteristics. If you're a biologist, you know what a secondary sexual characteristic is. Right, so a secondary sexual characteristic, the biological definition of a secondary sexual characteristic is some feature that an organism has that distinguishes it as a male or a female, but which is not directly involved in reproduction. Right, so it's some symbol or some external thing, some external features that a male will have versus a female that distinguishes it as a male or a female. Right, so the androgens are a group of steroid hormones. Like a good example would be testosterone, a group of steroid hormones that cause the male body shape to develop. So of course you know that males have bigger shoulders and narrower pelvis. With women it's the opposite. So that those larger shoulders and narrower pelvis, development of that shape is determined partially by the androgens. It's also the fact that men can develop muscle more easily than women. So men do a little bit of exercise and they build up all this muscle, and they lose. It's easier for men to lose weight, to lose adipose tissue. All of that is a function of the androgens. All right, in the ovaries produce a group of female-specific hormones called the estrogens, and the estrogens are responsible for the development of female secondary sexual characteristics, development of the female body shape. So as I said, before adolescence, boys and girls have a very similar body shape, and then as soon as adolescence starts, these estrogens are produced in women that produce the characteristic female body type, and the androgens are produced by males to give the classic male body shape. All right, let's see if we can remember all of these organs and what they're called and what they produce. All right, can you match the organs to the picture? You can stop the recording and see if you can. All right, resuming the recording. All right, so the pineal gland is located basically there. It's not shown on the chart. The hypothalamus is located there. The pituitary gland, posterior and anterior pituitary gland are located there. The thyroid gland is located there, along with the parathyroid glands on the posterior side. The adrenal gland cortex and the adrenal gland medulla, of course, are located there. The pancreas, located here, behind the stomach, directly behind the stomach. And this diagram is showing both the male and the female gonads. So the ovaries are located here on either side of the uterus, and the testes are located here. Okay, can you name the hormones that are produced by the posterior pituitary gland? You can stop the recording and see. All right, the answer is oxytocin, an antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. Can you name all the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland and what they do? Here's the answer. So we have growth hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. This is the anterior pituitary gland. So thyroid stimulating hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, what about the thyroid gland? Thyroid hormone and calcitonin. What about the parathyroid gland? Parathyroid hormone. Pancreas. Glucagon, insulin. All right, the adrenal gland cortex and the adrenal gland medulla. Adrenal gland cortex, the glucocorticoids like cortisol, mineralocorticoids like aldosterone. Medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine, though they both do the same thing. Okay, what about the ovaries and the testes? Ovaries produce the estrogens, and another set of hormones called the progestins. Testes produce the androgens. An example of an androgen is testosterone. Okay, all of these are peptide hormones, insulin, and glucagon, so that's why we have to inject insulin. A diabetic has to inject insulin instead of taking a pill. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is also a peptide hormone. So is growth hormone, and so is antidiuretic hormone. All right, the steroid hormones, cortisone, testosterone, and the estrogens are steroid hormones. So are the androgens, by the way. And now the amine hormones, these are made from modified amino acids. Epinephrine is a modified amino acid, and thyroid hormone is a modified amino acid. Okay, let's look at some pathologies of the endocrine system and a couple of definitions before we go into that. When you're talking about symptoms, you're talking about subjective things. Right, so subjective means things like pain or a headache, right? So a headache is a symptom of a disease or a pathology. The word etiology means what is the cause of the problem? What is the mechanism by which what's going on? Right. So on final exams, I often ask, what are the symptoms of this pathology versus the etiology. So what are some of the, and then I might say something like, these two diseases, these two pathologies have similar symptoms but different etiologies. Tell me what the symptoms are and tell me what the two different etiologies are. Right? So that, I'll give you fair warning, that could be a question I ask on the final exam. All right, so we're going to learn about pathologies of the pancreas, pathologies of the pituitary gland, and pathologies of the thyroid gland. Okay, starting with the pancreas. Diabetes mellitus. So the word diabetes refers to urination. Right? So the symptoms of diabetes mellitus are excessive thirst, excessive weight loss, excessive urination. That's where the dia comes from. Right? Fat is burned in place of glucose because your body can't properly metabolize glucose. The glucose is not getting converted into glycogen at any point and getting into the liver or the muscles. Instead, it remains in the bloodstream. Now, if you have a glucose concentration in the bloodstream that's too high, you actually end up fainting or possibly going into a coma. You become hyperglycemic. The blood is hyperglycemic because it has too much glucose. Right? So in the early days, before Frederick Banting discovered insulin as a treatment for diabetes, it's not a cure, it's a treatment. So before Banting discovered insulin as a treatment for diabetes, people would generally die of diabetes mellitus when they were in their teens or early 20s at the latest. The only way that you could prevent the blood hyperglycemia was to have a very sparse diet. You had a very, almost a starvation diet that was mostly proteins. So you were never allowed to eat anything sugary. You were only allowed to eat proteins and then only a very small amounts. And so people who had diabetes were always hungry. They always felt like they were starving, which is almost as bad as dying. And in spite of all of that, they would eventually the body was constantly breaking down the adipose tissue, so these people were very thin. And as you know, or as you may or may not know, when you break down proteins, some of the time their body would be breaking down their proteins, and as you know, we don't actually have any spare proteins. Right? So we have spare adipose tissue, but when that adipose tissue is broken down and disappears, the body goes after the proteins last. And so typically people who had diabetes, by the time they were in their teens, late teens, the body would be going after the proteins to generate energy. Regardless, if you ate sugar, you'd pass out or go into a coma, so you couldn't do that. You're eating a protein-rich diet, and then at the same time your body is breaking down some of your own proteins. And when you break down proteins, you create something called ketone bodies, which are kind of the remnants of broken down proteins. And you would see ketone bodies in your blood, and you would end up eventually developing a condition called ketoacidosis, which was the terminal phase, the last phase before you die, is ketoacidosis. And so people would die. It was a terrible disease. People would die from it all the time, and it was a terrible, terrible way to live and a terrible way to die. So that's why they were so happy when Frederick Banting discovered insulin as a treatment. Okay, so the etiology, that those are the symptoms. The etiology is that the pancreas doesn't make insulin, and this is one type of diabetes only, which is called type 1 diabetes mellitus. Type 2 diabetes is where your pancreas is fine, it makes insulin, but the receptors for the insulin on the cells don't work. So generally type 2 diabetes is not as severe as type 1 diabetes, but there's no treatment or cure for type 2 diabetes except a controlled diet. So you have a diet that's low in glucose and other things. All right, so the symptoms of diabetes mellitus are excessive thirst, weight loss, and excessive urination. And the etiology, the mechanism, what's gone wrong? That's the etiology. The etiology is that the pancreas can't make any insulin, so you treat that by injecting insulin. All right, so you have to take the pH of your blood by poking your finger. You poke your finger, take the pH of the blood. The pH of the blood tells you how much insulin to inject, and generally you're supposed to you have to inject yourself at least 3 times a day. You inject the insulin into the fatty tissue because it doesn't go directly into the blood. It's released slowly into the blood that way. So you don't have this, you've heard of crashing because of you run in a marathon, and when all the glucose in your body is gone, you do what's called crashing or hitting the wall. So that sudden feeling of exhaustion that you get when you're running in a marathon because your body has suddenly burnt up all of the glucose that was in the blood and you have no other source. Well, if you injected glucose directly into your bloodstream, it would very quickly suck all of the glucose out of your bloodstream and convert it into glycogen, and you'd feel that crash or hitting the wall again. So you want the glucose to be released gradually. The simplest way to do that is to inject the glucose into the adipose tissue, where it'll be absorbed into the blood more slowly. Nevertheless, if you're a diabetic, you have this terrible fate of having to poke your fingers 3 times a day and then poke yourself with a needle 3 times a day. Diabetics say that they get used to it, but I can't imagine it's ever very pleasant. All right, now this is interesting. Diabetes insipidus. So we just talked about diabetes mellitus, and that's a problem with the pancreas. The etiology is that the pancreas doesn't make enough insulin. Now diabetes insipidus has a very similar name, and that's because the name is derived from the symptoms, and the symptoms are excessive urination, which is where dia comes from, excessive urination, and thirst, excessive thirst. So it has similar symptoms to diabetes mellitus. Diabetes insipidus and diabetes mellitus have very similar symptoms. They have slightly different names, but very similar symptoms, similar names, but the etiology is different. Right, so the etiology of diabetes insipidus is that the pituitary gland doesn't produce enough antidiuretic hormone, and you treat that by taking vasopressin tablets, antidiuretic hormone tablets. All right, so diabetes mellitus and diabetes insipidus have similar symptoms, but different etiologies. Similar names, similar symptoms, different etiologies. All right, now let's look at some other problems with the pituitary gland. Okay, so pituitary dwarfism, you have a small stature. That's because the etiology is your pituitary gland doesn't make enough growth hormone. You can fix that by taking drugs, specially designed substitute for growth hormone. And pituitary giantism is the symptom is that you're very large, you grow very tall, and the etiology is that the pituitary gland is making too much growth hormone. Sometimes that's because there's a tumor. There's a cancerous tumor on your pituitary gland that is forcing it to become overactive. Okay, so pituitary dwarfism, as I said, Charlotte Garside doesn't have pituitary dwarfism per se, but before they invented artificial growth hormone, there were some people around who had pituitary dwarfism, and pituitary giantism is because too much growth hormone causes you to continue growing and growing and growing during adolescence. All right, now let's look at problems with the thyroid gland. Okay, hyper means too much, doesn't it? And hypo means too little. Okay, so hyperthyroidism means an overactive thyroid gland. All right, the symptoms are that you have a high body temperature. We learned about that because thyroid hormone causes too much glucose, an excess of glucose to be burned in the mitochondria. Half of that energy is released through heat, so you tend to be sweaty and high strung and feel hot all the time. That's a symptom of hyperthyroidism. You tend to be irritable because you have so much energy and you feel hot all the time that you have trouble sleeping, right? So you tend to be a little bit irritable. You tend to be thin because you're burning all of the body's glucose rather than converting any of it into adipose tissue. You tend to have high blood pressure. One of the symptoms of high blood pressure is that you have bulgy eyes because there are capillaries behind the orbital area that kind of fill up with fluid and then push your eyes forward. And occasionally you get something called a swollen goiter. A goiter is actually a swollen thyroid gland. So you have this lump below the Adam's apple, this kind of bump, which is a swollen, enlarged thyroid gland. And the etiology is that you either have an overactive thyroid gland or you have an overactive pituitary gland that's producing too much thyroid stimulating hormone. Which symptom do you think would be missing if it was actually the pituitary gland that was the problem? If you want to think about that for a minute. The answer is you wouldn't have a goiter if there was a problem with your pituitary gland producing too much thyroid stimulating hormone as opposed to the thyroid gland producing too much thyroid hormone by itself. Okay, I don't know, I haven't checked recently, but the traditional method for treating hyperthyroidism used to be you would simply put an X-ray machine up against the thyroid gland and irradiate it until you killed it. Right, so you would kill the thyroid gland with radiation, and then you would compensate by taking thyroid pills, thyroid hormone pills. They might have come up with a less barbaric way to treat it now, but that's the way they used to treat it. All right, so here you have somebody who has hyperthyroidism. They're sweaty, thin, irritable, sometimes irritable. Sometimes you have a swollen thyroid gland because the goiter, because here you can see on the inside of this, there's a normal sized thyroid gland, and then in hyperthyroidism, you have one that's twice as big, forming this structure called a goiter. Right? And sometimes bulgy eyes. You have a lot of energy, but you don't sleep very well, tend to feel hot all the time because of the increased metabolic rate. All right, the opposite, of course, would be hypothyroidism. Right, so the symptoms are that you have low energy and you experience lethargy. Lethargy is that feeling of just not wanting to do anything. You just want to sit on the couch and watch TV. You don't really feel like getting up off the couch and working. That's referred to as lethargy. It's as much an emotional thing as it is an energy thing. You tend to gain weight quite easily because your body is never burning the glucose. And when you eat a lot of glucose and you don't burn it in the mitochondria, you end up converting it to lipids and storing it in adipose tissue. If you're female, you have long, painful menstrual cycles, and the opposite of bulging eyes, you have kind of puffy eyes. And the etiology is that for whatever reason, you have an underactive thyroid gland. The treatment is you take thyroid hormone pills. Okay, so this is one of the first examples of taking thyroid hormone pills to be used as a treatment for hypothyroidism, right? So this is back from the 19th century, the late 19th century, where they figured out that you could treat hypothyroidism by taking the thyroid glands of cadavers. You would take the thyroid glands out of dead people, you would dry them out and crush them into a powder and make them into a pill without knowing what the active ingredient was inside the pill. And then you could convert a hypothyroid person into a regular person. Today we have artificial thyroid hormone. Okay, so again, the symptoms: puffy eyes, easy weight gain, easily gaining of weight and building of adipose tissue, long painful menstrual cycles, lethargy, tiredness and lethargy, feeling of cold. So instead of feeling hot all the time the way you do when you have hyperthyroidism, you feel cold all the time. All right, so we discussed how hormones work. These are intracellular signals. Some of them are made of steroids, some of them are made of peptides, and so on. Right? And we talked about the different types of hormone signaling: endocrine signaling versus paracrine and autocrine signaling, and neuroendocrine signaling, which is not on the list. We did a long review of the major endocrine organs: the pituitary gland, anterior versus posterior, the pineal gland, the thyroid, parathyroid, etc. And we did a discussion of endocrine system pathologies. All right, that leaves us, the next lecture is officially the renal system, but that one has already been recorded, so we're a little bit out of sequence. And then this will leave us with only the final lecture on the reproductive system. So that is next. By the way, this is just the different lists showing the different hormones and where they're produced. These are the tropic hormones produced by the pituitary gland on the anterior side. And then these are the other hormones that are produced by other endocrine glands. One little exercise for the pathologies. Let's see if you can guess which organ is affected and which hormone is affected by each of the following pathologies. I'll let you stop the recording and see if you can guess what they all are, see if you've learned what they all are. Okay, so in each of these pathologies, these are the organs that are affected. What about the hormones that are produced by those organs? These are the hormones that are affected for all of these pathologies. All right, I'll see you you can take a look at the renal system lecture, and then I'll see you at the reproductive system lecture.